The morning sun had not yet risen over the small village when Grace opened her eyes. The sky outside was still dark, and the air was cold. Roosters were only beginning to crow, and the village was quiet except for the sound of insects singing in the bushes. Grace slowly sat up from the thin mat she slept on in the corner of the kitchen. She did not have a bedroom like everyone else in the house. While her uncle, aunt, and cousins slept on soft beds inside comfortable rooms, Grace slept on an old mat beside sacks of rice, pots, and firewood. She stretched her tired arms and quietly whispered her usual morning prayer. "Thank you, God, for another day. Please give me strength." Grace was only 21 years old, but life had already made her stronger than many people much older than her. She had learned not to complain. She had learned to smile even when her heart was hurting. She had learned to hope, even when life gave her many reasons to give up. Her parents had died when she was only 6 years old. She still remembered that terrible day. She remembered waiting outside her small house for them to return from the market. Instead, neighbors came running with tears in their eyes. "There has been an accident," someone had said. Grace was too young to understand everything, but she understood one thing. Her mother and father were never coming back. After the funeral, her father's older brother, Uncle Peter, took her into his home. At first, Grace thought everything would be all right. She believed her uncle would love her like his own daughter. But that hope slowly disappeared. As the years passed, she realized she was not treated like family. She was treated like a servant. Every day followed the same routine. Before sunrise, Grace swept the compound. She picked up dry leaves, gathered rubbish, and cleaned every corner until the ground looked neat. If Aunt Martha found even one leaf on the ground, she became angry. "Grace," she shouted one morning, "didn't you sweep this place?" "I did, Auntie." "Then why is there a leaf over there?" "I'm sorry. The wind must have." Before Grace could finish speaking, Aunt Martha interrupted. "Stop making excuses." Grace lowered her head. "I'm sorry." After sweeping, she carried 2 heavy buckets and walked nearly 30 minutes to the river. The path was rough and dusty. Sometimes the buckets felt so heavy that her shoulders hurt. But she never stopped. Other young women from the village often met her on the road. Some smiled kindly. Others whispered to one another, "There goes Uncle Peter's orphan. I feel sorry for her. That woman works harder than anyone." Grace heard the whispers but pretended not to notice. She simply smiled politely and continued walking. When she returned with the water, she hurried to prepare breakfast. She lit the firewood and cooked while everyone else was still sleeping. By the time Uncle Peter and his family woke up, breakfast was already on the table. Her cousins, David and Sarah, rubbed their sleepy eyes as they sat down to eat. David looked at Grace. "Bring me more tea." Grace quickly obeyed. Sarah pushed her empty plate toward Grace. "I'm finished. Wash this." Grace nodded. "Yes." No one ever said, "Please." No one ever said, "Thank you." After serving everyone, Grace waited. Only after they finished eating was she allowed to eat whatever food remained. Some mornings there was enough. Other mornings there was only a small piece of bread or a spoonful of porridge. She accepted whatever was left without complaining. She had learned that arguing only made things worse. Once breakfast was over, Grace washed every plate, cup, and spoon. Then she washed everyone's clothes by hand. The pile of dirty clothes always seemed endless. Her hands were rough from years of scrubbing. Sometimes they became sore and cracked, but she kept working. While hanging the clothes outside, Grace watched children walking to school. They laughed together as they carried colorful school bags. She smiled sadly. School had always been her dream. Before her parents died, they often told her she was very smart. "You'll become a teacher one day," her mother used to say. Grace remembered those words often. Unfortunately, after moving in with Uncle Peter, her education stopped. "There is no money for school," Aunt Martha always said. Yet Grace noticed something. There was always enough money to buy new clothes for David and Sarah. There was always enough money to pay their school fees. Only Grace was told there was no money. Even so, she refused to stop learning. Whenever David and Sarah threw away old schoolbooks, Grace secretly picked them up. At night, after everyone had gone to bed, she lit a small candle and taught herself to read. She practiced writing words on old pieces of paper. Sometimes she copied entire pages just to improve her handwriting. One evening, Uncle Peter caught her reading. "What are you doing?" Grace stood quickly. "I was just reading." He frowned. "Books won't cook food." He took the book from her hands. "You have work to do." Then he threw the book into the fire. Grace watched the pages curl as the flames swallowed them. She wanted to cry. Instead, she simply whispered, "Yes, Uncle." Later that night, after everyone was asleep, she quietly wiped the tears from her eyes. She promised herself something. "One day, I will learn again. I won't give up." Grace's kind heart never changed. Whenever an elderly neighbor needed help carrying firewood, she gladly helped. If she saw a hungry child, she shared part of her own meal. Even though she had very little, she always found a way to help others. The neighbors noticed. Old Mama Rose, who lived across the road, often watched Grace working. One afternoon she called out softly, "Grace." Grace smiled. "Good afternoon, Mama." Mama Rose handed her a ripe mango. "I know you haven't eaten much today." Grace shook her head. "I can't take your food." Mama Rose smiled warmly. Kindness should always be shared. Grace accepted the mango. "Thank you." As she walked away, Aunt Martha appeared. "What is that?" Grace looked down. "Mama Rose gave me a mango." Aunt Martha snatched it from her hand. "If you have time to collect gifts, then you have time to work." She walked away with the mango, leaving Grace standing there. Mama Rose watched everything from her yard. She sighed sadly. That girl deserves so much better. Many villagers felt the same way. Everyone knew Grace worked harder than anyone else. They also knew she never answered insults with anger. She remained respectful. She greeted everyone politely. She smiled even on difficult days. Some people wondered how she stayed so kind after suffering for so many years. The truth was simple. Grace remembered the lessons her parents had taught her. Her mother often said, "Never let other people's bitterness make your heart bitter." Her father used to say, "A good heart is worth more than gold." Those words stayed with Grace. Whenever life became difficult, she repeated them quietly to herself. One Saturday afternoon, David and Sarah were preparing for a birthday party in the next village. They wore beautiful new clothes and polished shoes. Grace admired them from the doorway. Sarah noticed. "What are you looking at?" "Nothing. You're just jealous because you're staying home." David laughed. "Who would invite a servant to a party?" The two cousins laughed together before leaving. Grace remained silent. Their words hurt, but she had grown used to such treatment. After they left, she continued washing the family's cooking pots. As she scrubbed, she looked at her reflection in the water. Her clothes were old and faded. Her sandals were worn out. Her hands were rough, but her eyes still held hope. Deep inside, Grace believed her story was not over. She believed God had a better future waiting for her. She just did not know when it would come. That evening, after finishing all her chores, Grace sat outside beneath the wide branches of a large mango tree. The sky was filled with bright stars. A cool breeze gently blew across the village. It was the only peaceful moment of her day. She looked up at the sky and smiled softly. "I miss you, Mom. I miss you, Dad. I hope you're proud of me." A single tear rolled down her cheek. She quickly wiped it away. Then she folded her hands and prayed. "Dear God, thank you for keeping me alive. I know life is hard right now, but I still trust you. Please help me. Please show me that tomorrow can be better than today. Give me strength to keep going, and help me never stop being kind, no matter how people treat me." After her prayer, Grace stood up and walked back into the house. She did not know that everything was about to change. Very soon, a single event would force her to leave the only home she had known since childhood. It would be painful. It would be frightening. But it would also lead her to the greatest blessing of her life, a future she had never dared to imagine. Grace woke up before the first rooster crowed. just as she did every morning. She quietly folded the thin mat she had slept on and placed it in the corner of the kitchen. Then she picked up the broom and began sweeping the compound while the rest of the family slept peacefully. The cool morning breeze brushed against her face as she worked. Dry leaves had fallen from the trees during the night, and Grace carefully swept every corner until the yard looked clean. When she finished, she carried 2 empty buckets to the river. The walk was long, but she was used to it. As she returned with the heavy buckets balanced carefully, she noticed smoke rising from the kitchen chimney. Aunt Martha was already awake. Grace hurried inside. "Good morning, Auntie," she said politely. Aunt Martha did not answer. Instead, she pointed toward the cooking pot. "Why are you just coming back? Hurry up and prepare breakfast." "I'm sorry," Grace replied softly. She quickly lit the firewood and began cooking. Within an hour, breakfast was ready. Uncle Peter sat at the dining table reading an old newspaper while David and Sarah laughed about something that had happened at school the previous day. Grace served everyone quietly. She stood nearby in case anyone needed more food. David held out his empty cup. "More tea?" "Yes." Sarah pushed her plate toward Grace. "I don't want eggs anymore. Take them away." Grace picked up the plate. Only after everyone had finished eating did she sit down to eat the little food that remained. There was only one small piece of bread. She smiled anyway. "Thank you, God." After breakfast, Aunt Martha handed Grace another long list of chores. "Wash the clothes. Clean the windows. Scrub the bathroom. Then weed the garden." Grace nodded. "I'll do them." By midday, sweat covered her face. Her hands were sore from scrubbing. Still, she kept working. She believed that if she finished everything well, perhaps Aunt Martha would be pleased for once. But that day would become the worst day of her life. Later that afternoon, Aunt Martha decided to clean the living room. She wanted the house to look nice because a visitor was expected the following day. She carefully dusted the shelves where her favorite flower vase stood. It was a beautiful blue vase that she often bragged about. "My sister bought this for me many years ago," she always said. "It is the most expensive thing in this house." Grace was outside hanging wet clothes on a line when she heard a loud crash. Smash! The sound echoed through the house. Grace quickly dropped the clothes and ran inside. Pieces of the blue vase were scattered across the floor. Sarah stood nearby looking frightened. Before Grace could ask what had happened, Sarah quietly stepped backward. Aunt Martha entered the room. She looked at the broken vase. Her eyes became wide with anger. "My vase!" She looked around the room. Grace had just entered. Without asking any questions, Aunt Martha pointed at her. "You did this." Grace's eyes widened. "No, Auntie. I just came inside after hearing the noise." "Liar! I didn't touch it." Sarah lowered her head but said nothing. She knew she had accidentally knocked the vase over while trying to reach a book, but she was afraid to admit it. She remained silent. Aunt Martha's face turned red. "I knew you would destroy something one day." Grace shook her head desperately. "I promise I didn't." At that moment, Uncle Peter walked into the house. "What is all this shouting?" Aunt Martha pointed at the broken pieces. "Look what your niece has done." Uncle Peter stared at the floor. His face became hard. He slowly turned toward Grace. "Is this true?" Grace felt tears filling her eyes. "No, Uncle. I didn't break it. I only came after I heard the noise." Aunt Martha folded her arms. "She's lying. I've been warning you about this girl. She doesn't appreciate anything we do for her." Grace looked toward Sarah. She hoped her cousin would tell the truth. Sarah avoided her eyes. She remained completely silent. Grace's heart sank. Uncle Peter sighed angrily. "For years we have fed you. We gave you a place to stay. And this is how you repay us?" Grace could hardly believe what she was hearing. "I didn't do it." Her voice shook. "I promise." But Uncle Peter had already made up his mind. "I've had enough. You are nothing but trouble." Grace dropped to her knees. "Please, Uncle. I have nowhere else to go. I'll work harder. I'll do anything. Please don't send me away." For a brief moment, Uncle Peter hesitated. Then Aunt Martha spoke again. If she stays, she'll only cause more problems. Send her away. David crossed his arms. I think she should leave too. Grace looked at Sarah one last time. Sarah still said nothing. Not a single word. Grace realized she was completely alone. Uncle Peter walked into the kitchen. He picked up Grace's small cloth bag. Inside were all her belongings. 2 old dresses, 1 pair of worn sandals, a small towel, an old family photograph of her parents, and a small Bible with torn pages. That was everything she owned. He threw the bag toward the front door. Take your things. Grace slowly stood. Her hands were trembling. She picked up the bag. Tears rolled down her cheeks. She looked around the house. It had never truly felt like home. Still, it was the only place she had lived since she was 6 years old. She walked toward Uncle Peter. Please. He pointed toward the gate. Leave. Now. Grace took 1 slow step, then another. As she reached the gate, Aunt Martha shouted behind her. And don't ever come back. The gate slammed shut. The loud sound echoed through Grace's heart. Some neighbors had heard the shouting. They stepped outside to see what was happening. Mama Rose hurried across the road. Peter, what are you doing? She's only a young girl. Uncle Peter folded his arms. This is family business. Mama Rose looked at Grace standing outside with tears running down her face. She walked over and hugged her gently. My child. Grace began crying even harder. I don't know where to go. Mama Rose reached into her pocket. She handed Grace a small piece of bread and a bottle of water. It's not much, but take it. Grace hugged her. Thank you. Several villagers whispered among themselves. Poor girl. She has nowhere. This isn't right. But no one challenged Uncle Peter directly. Everyone slowly returned to their homes. Grace was left standing alone on the dusty road. She looked back one final time. The gate remained closed. No one came after her. No one called her name. No one changed their mind. She wiped her tears. Then she began walking. The afternoon sun grew hotter. Grace walked slowly along the dusty road leading away from the village. She did not know where she was going. She simply kept moving. Hours passed. Her feet began hurting inside her old sandals. She grew hungry. The small piece of bread Mama Rose had given her was already gone. She drank the last drop of water. Still she walked. She passed green farms where farmers harvested vegetables. She crossed a small wooden bridge over a narrow stream. Birds flew across the bright blue sky. Children laughed while playing near their homes. Grace watched them quietly. She wished her childhood had been like theirs. As evening approached, dark clouds slowly gathered. A cool wind began blowing. Soon, rain started falling. At first it was light. Then it became heavy. Grace looked around for shelter. She spotted a large tree beside the road. She hurried underneath it. The thick branches protected her from most of the rain. She hugged her small bag tightly against her chest. Inside was the photograph of her parents. She carefully took it out. The picture had become old and faded. Her mother smiled warmly in the photograph. Her father stood proudly beside her. Grace gently touched the picture. I wish you were here. I don't know what to do. Fresh tears rolled down her face. Night slowly covered the land. The rain stopped. The stars appeared once again. Grace felt cold. She had never slept outside before. Every sound frightened her. The chirping of crickets, the rustling leaves, the distant barking of dogs. She pulled her bag close and rested her head against the tree. Before closing her eyes, she folded her hands. Dear God, she whispered. Today I lost the only home I knew. I don't know where tomorrow will take me. I'm scared, and I feel alone. But I know you are with me. Please guide my steps. Please send someone kind into my life. Help me not to lose hope. She closed her eyes. Within minutes, exhaustion overcame her. She fell asleep beneath the tree, with nothing but the stars above her and her little bag beside her. Not far away, headlights from a luxury SUV appeared on the quiet road. The driver was returning from a business meeting in the nearby city. He had no idea that a single stop on this lonely road would change not only Grace's life, but his own forever. The first rays of the morning sun slowly spread across the quiet countryside. Birds began singing in the trees, welcoming a new day. The cool breeze gently blew through the leaves of the large tree where Grace had spent the night. She slowly opened her eyes. For a few seconds, she forgot where she was. Then she looked around. The dusty road, the tall tree, her small cloth bag beside her. Everything came rushing back. She remembered being sent away from her uncle's house. She remembered walking for hours with nowhere to go. She remembered crying herself to sleep under the tree. Grace sat up slowly and stretched her aching body. Her back hurt from sleeping on the hard ground. Her stomach growled loudly. She had eaten only a small piece of bread the previous afternoon. Now she was hungry again. She reached into her bag and took out the old photograph of her parents. She smiled sadly as she looked at their faces. "I miss you so much," she whispered. "I wish you were here to tell me everything will be okay." She carefully placed the picture back into her bag. Then she stood up. "I have to keep going," she said quietly to herself. But where? She had no answer. She looked down the long road that stretched ahead of her. It seemed endless. Grace began walking once more. Each step felt heavier than the last. She was tired, hungry, scared, but she refused to stop. "My parents always taught me never to give up," she whispered. "I'll keep moving." About 30 minutes later, she reached a small roadside market. A few women were arranging fruits on wooden tables. Some men were unloading bags of rice from an old truck. The smell of freshly baked bread filled the air. Grace's stomach growled again. She watched people buying food. She wished she had enough money to buy even one loaf of bread. A woman selling oranges noticed her. "My dear," the woman said kindly, "are you looking for someone?" Grace smiled politely. "No, ma'am." "Have you eaten this morning?" Grace hesitated. She did not like asking people for help. "I'm all right." The woman could tell she was not telling the truth. She picked up 2 oranges and handed them to Grace. "Take these." Grace quickly shook her head. "I can't." The woman smiled. "You remind me of my daughter. Please take them." Grace accepted the oranges with grateful eyes. "Thank you very much. God bless you." The woman smiled warmly. "And may he bless you too." Grace walked away while eating one of the oranges. It was the sweetest fruit she had tasted in a long time. She thanked God for sending kind people into her life. Even small acts of kindness meant everything to her. After leaving the market, she continued walking along the road. The sun climbed higher into the sky. The weather became warmer. Cars occasionally drove past her. Most never slowed down. Nobody noticed the young woman walking alone with a small bag over her shoulder. Then something unexpected happened. A sleek black SUV appeared around the corner. It was unlike any vehicle Grace had ever seen. Its shiny paint reflected the bright sunlight. The windows were dark. The expensive car moved smoothly along the road. As it approached Grace, it suddenly slowed down. Then it stopped. Grace became nervous. She stepped backward. The driver's door opened. A tall young man stepped out. He looked to be around 29 years old. He wore a neatly tailored navy blue suit and polished black shoes. His watch sparkled in the sunlight. Yet, despite his elegant appearance, there was kindness in his eyes. He looked at Grace with concern. "Excuse me," he said gently. "Are you all right?" Grace lowered her eyes. "Yes." The man smiled softly. "I don't think that's true." Grace remained silent. "My name is Daniel King. And yours?" She looked up. "I'm Grace." "It's nice to meet you, Grace." Daniel noticed her worn-out sandals. He noticed the dust on her clothes. He noticed the tired look on her face. Most of all, he noticed that although she looked exhausted, she still spoke politely. "Have you had breakfast?" he asked. Grace wanted to say yes. She did not want anyone to pity her. But her stomach answered before she could speak. It growled loudly. Daniel smiled kindly. "I think that answers my question." Grace blushed with embarrassment. "I'm sorry. You don't have to apologize. He pointed toward a small restaurant across the road. Would you let me buy you breakfast? Grace hesitated. Her uncle had always warned her never to trust strangers. But Daniel's calm voice made her feel safe. He did not seem dangerous. He simply seemed kind. After a moment, she nodded. Thank you. They walked together into the small restaurant. The owner quickly recognized Daniel. Good morning, sir. Your usual table? Daniel smiled. Yes. Grace looked around in surprise. The restaurant was clean and welcoming. She had never eaten in a place like this before. They sat down. The waiter handed Daniel a menu. Daniel looked at Grace. What would you like? Grace stared at the menu. She had never seen so many choices. I don't know. Daniel smiled. Then let me choose. Soon the waiter returned with warm bread, eggs, rice, chicken, fresh fruit, and juice. Grace's eyes widened. This is too much. Daniel laughed gently. Eat as much as you want. Grace quietly thanked God before eating. She tried not to eat too quickly, but she was so hungry that she finished almost everything on her plate. Daniel pretended not to notice. He did not want to embarrass her. When she finished, she smiled shyly. That was the best meal I've had in years. Daniel looked surprised. Years? Grace realized she had said too much. She looked down. I'm sorry. You don't have to be sorry. If you don't mind. What happened? Grace took a deep breath. For a moment she wondered whether she should tell him the truth. Then she remembered his kindness. She decided to trust him. She slowly told him everything. She spoke about losing her parents when she was 6 years old. She explained how she had moved in with her uncle. She described years of hard work. She talked about never being allowed to continue school. She explained how she had been blamed for breaking the flower vase. Finally, she told him how she had been thrown out of the house. Daniel listened without interrupting. The more he heard, the sadder he became. When Grace finished speaking, there was silence. Daniel shook his head slowly. You've been through so much. Grace smiled gently. I've learned that life can change. I just don't know when. Daniel admired her answer. Many people become bitter after suffering. Grace had not. She still believed in hope. She still believed in kindness. That impressed him more than anything else. After paying for breakfast, Daniel and Grace walked outside. Daniel looked toward his SUV. Then he looked back at Grace. Do you have anywhere to go? Grace shook her head. No. Any relatives? No. Any friends? She smiled sadly. No. Daniel stood quietly for a moment. His assistant, Michael, who had been waiting inside the SUV, walked over. Sir, Michael said quietly, your meeting in the city starts in 2 hours. Daniel nodded. Then he turned back to Grace. I want to help you. Grace quickly shook her head. You've already done enough. Daniel smiled. I don't think I have. Grace looked confused. I have a guest house in the city. You can stay there until you decide what you want to do next. Grace's eyes widened. I couldn't. Why not? You don't even know me. Daniel smiled. I know enough. I know you're honest. I know you're respectful. And I know you deserve a chance. Grace felt tears filling her eyes again. No one had spoken to her like that in many years. She looked down. What if I become a burden? Daniel laughed softly. You won't. My grandmother used to tell me something. Grace looked at him. What did she say? If God blesses you, don't close your hands. Use your blessings to lift others. Daniel smiled. I've tried to live by those words. Grace wiped away a tear. Thank you. Daniel opened the passenger door of the SUV. Shall we? Grace looked once more at the long dusty road behind her. Just yesterday she had been homeless, frightened, and alone. Now someone was offering her hope. She took a deep breath. Then she stepped into the vehicle. As the SUV pulled away, Grace looked out the window. The road where she had cried herself to sleep disappeared behind them. She did not realize it yet, but she was leaving her painful past behind. Ahead of her was a future she could never have imagined. a future filled with opportunities, healing, friendship, and a love that would one day change both her life and Daniel's forever. Grace sat quietly inside the black SUV as it drove smoothly along the highway. She had never ridden in such a beautiful car before. The seats were soft, and cool air flowed gently from the air conditioner. Everything inside looked clean and expensive. She held her small cloth bag tightly on her lap. It contained everything she owned: 2 old dresses, a worn Bible, and the faded photograph of her parents. She looked out the window as villages, farms, and busy roads passed by. Everything felt new. Everything felt different. Daniel noticed that Grace had hardly spoken since they left the restaurant. He smiled kindly. "You don't have to be nervous." Grace looked at him. "I'm sorry. What are you apologizing for?" "I've never been in a car like this before." Daniel chuckled. "There's no need to apologize for that." Grace smiled a little. She was still finding it hard to believe that someone she had met only a short time ago was treating her with so much kindness. After nearly 2 hours of driving, the SUV entered the city. Grace's eyes grew wide. Tall buildings stood proudly on both sides of the road. Traffic lights changed from red to green. People hurried along the sidewalks. Large shopping malls, hotels, and offices stretched as far as she could see. She had never imagined a place like this. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Daniel smiled. "Welcome to the city." Grace continued staring out the window. "So many people. So many buildings." Daniel laughed softly. "You'll get used to it." The SUV finally turned into a quiet neighborhood lined with beautiful trees and well-kept gardens. A large black gate slowly opened. The car drove inside. Grace gasped. In front of her stood a magnificent white mansion surrounded by colorful flowers and green lawns. A fountain sparkled in the middle of the driveway. The house had tall windows, elegant balconies, and a wide front porch. Grace had never seen such a place except in pictures. She looked at Daniel in disbelief. Do you live here?" Daniel shook his head. "No. This is one of my guest houses." Grace stared at him. "One of them?" Daniel smiled. "Yes." Grace was speechless. She could not imagine owning even one small house, yet Daniel spoke about several houses as though it were normal. The front door opened before they reached it. An elderly woman wearing a neat uniform stepped outside with a warm smile. "Welcome home, sir." "Thank you, Mrs. Agnes." Daniel turned toward Grace. "This is Mrs. Agnes. She has looked after this house for many years." Mrs. Agnes smiled kindly. "It is nice to meet you." Grace bowed her head respectfully. "It's nice to meet you too." Daniel picked up Grace's small bag. "I'll show you around." Grace quickly reached for it. "I can carry it." Daniel handed it back with a smile. "All right." They walked through the front door. Grace stopped walking. The inside of the house was even more beautiful than the outside. The floor shone like a mirror. Large paintings decorated the walls. Soft sofas surrounded a glass table. A sparkling chandelier hung from the ceiling. Fresh flowers filled the room with a pleasant smell. Grace looked around slowly. "I'm afraid to touch anything." Daniel laughed. "You don't have to be. It's just a house." Grace smiled nervously. "It doesn't look like just a house." Daniel smiled. "I suppose you're right." He led her upstairs. They stopped in front of a large bedroom. Daniel opened the door. "This room is yours." Grace stepped inside. Her eyes filled with surprise. The room was larger than Uncle Peter's entire house. There was a large bed with soft white blankets. A wooden wardrobe stood beside the wall. A study table faced the window. Fresh flowers sat on a small table near the bed. There was even a private bathroom. Grace slowly walked around the room. She gently touched the bed. "It's so soft." Daniel smiled. "I hope you'll be comfortable here." Grace turned toward him. "I don't know how to thank you." "You don't have to." "I do." "No. You just need time to rest." Grace nodded quietly. Daniel walked toward the door. "I have some meetings today. Mrs. Agnes will help you if you need anything. I'll come back this evening." Grace smiled. "Thank you." After Daniel left, Grace sat on the edge of the bed. Everything felt like a dream. She carefully opened her cloth bag. She took out the old photograph of her parents. Holding it close, she smiled through tears. "Mom, Dad, I wish you could see this. I don't understand why all this is happening, but I know you're watching over me." She placed the photograph beside the bed. Then she knelt and prayed. "Dear God, thank you for protecting me yesterday. Thank you for sending Daniel into my life. Please help me never forget where I came from. Teach me to always be grateful." When she finished praying, someone gently knocked on the door. Mrs. Agnes entered with a smile. "I've prepared warm water for your bath." Grace stood quickly. "You didn't have to." Mrs. Agnes smiled. "It is my job." Grace followed her into the bathroom. Her mouth fell open. There was a large bathtub. Soft white towels were neatly folded on a shelf. The room smelled of fresh soap. Grace had never seen anything like it. Mrs. Agnes showed her how everything worked. "If you need anything, just call me." "Thank you." Grace enjoyed the warm bath. As the dirt from the road washed away, she felt as though some of her sadness was washing away too. After changing back into her old clothes, she came downstairs. Mrs. Agnes looked at her kindly. "Mr. Daniel asked me to take you shopping." Grace's eyes widened. "Shopping?" "Yes, for clothes." Grace quickly shook her head. No, I already have clothes." Mrs. Agnes smiled gently. "My dear, you have only 2 dresses." Grace looked embarrassed. "They're enough." Mrs. Agnes laughed softly. "Come with me." A short time later they arrived at a large clothing store. Grace froze at the entrance. "I don't belong here." Mrs. Agnes placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Today you do." Inside, rows of beautiful dresses, shoes, handbags, and accessories filled the store. Grace had never seen so many beautiful clothes in one place. A saleswoman smiled warmly. "Welcome." Mrs. Agnes explained that they were shopping for Grace. Soon several dresses were brought for her to try. Grace disappeared into the changing room. A few minutes later she stepped out wearing a simple sky blue dress. Mrs. Agnes smiled brightly. "You look wonderful." Grace looked into the mirror. She barely recognized herself. For years she had worn faded, patched clothes. Now she looked elegant. She touched the fabric gently. "It feels so soft." The saleswoman smiled. "It suits you perfectly." Grace tried several more outfits. Each one fit beautifully. She also received comfortable shoes, sandals, a warm sweater, and other necessities. Grace kept thanking everyone. "You don't have to thank us every minute," Mrs. Agnes said with a laugh. Grace smiled shyly. "I've never had anyone buy things for me before." Mrs. Agnes looked at her with kind eyes. "Then perhaps it's time life became kinder to you." When they returned to the house, Grace carefully placed the new clothes in the wardrobe. She smiled every time she opened the door. It still felt unbelievable. That evening Daniel returned from work. Mrs. Agnes welcomed him inside. Grace came downstairs wearing one of the new dresses. Daniel smiled warmly. "It looks like the shopping went well." Grace nodded. "I still can't believe all this." Daniel noticed something. Even with beautiful clothes, Grace remained humble. She did not act proud. She did not boast. Instead, she thanked everyone who helped her. That impressed him even more. During dinner they sat together at the large dining table. Grace ate slowly. She still found it strange to have so much food in front of her. Daniel noticed. "You can eat as much as you like." Grace smiled. "I'm still getting used to it." Daniel nodded. "I understand." After dinner they walked into the garden. The evening breeze was cool. Colorful flowers surrounded the stone pathways. Birds chirped as the sun slowly disappeared behind the trees. Daniel broke the silence. "Grace." "Yes. I was thinking." She looked at him. "You mentioned that you stopped going to school." Grace nodded. "When I was 6. Would you like to continue learning?" Grace stared at him. For a moment she could not speak. Her eyes slowly filled with tears. "You mean you would help me?" Daniel smiled. If that's what you want. Grace nodded quickly. More than anything. I've dreamed about learning again for years. Daniel smiled. Then we'll make it happen. Grace covered her mouth as tears rolled down her cheeks. No one had ever asked about her dreams before. No one had ever cared what she wanted. For the first time since losing her parents, someone believed her future mattered. The next few days passed quickly. Daniel arranged for a private teacher to help Grace catch up on the education she had missed. Her teacher, Miss Evelyn, was patient and encouraging. Grace worked harder than anyone expected. She woke up early each morning, studied for hours, and asked thoughtful questions. She read every book she could find. She practiced writing until her hand became tired. Whenever she solved a difficult lesson, her face lit up with joy. Miss Evelyn smiled one afternoon. Grace, you learn faster than many of my students. Grace smiled modestly. I've waited a long time for this chance. Daniel often checked on her progress after work. He was amazed by her determination. Every day Grace grew more confident. Every day her smile became brighter. Every day the sadness in her eyes faded a little more. One evening, as Daniel watched Grace laughing with Mrs. Agnes over dinner, he smiled quietly to himself. He realized that bringing Grace into his life had not only changed her future. It had also brought warmth and happiness into a house that had once felt quiet and empty. Neither of them knew it yet, but this new beginning was only the first step toward a beautiful future that would change both of their lives forever. Several weeks passed after Grace moved into Daniel's guest house. Life had changed so much that some mornings she woke up wondering if she was still dreaming. Instead of being shouted at before sunrise, she woke to the sound of birds singing outside her window. Instead of sleeping on a thin mat in the kitchen, she slept in a soft bed that made her feel warm and comfortable. Instead of spending every hour doing endless chores, she now spent her mornings studying with Miss Evelyn. Every day felt like a precious gift. Grace never took any of it for granted. Each morning, she carefully made her bed, folded her clothes neatly, and thanked Mrs. Agnes whenever breakfast was served. Mrs. Agnes often smiled to herself. "This young lady has such good manners," she would say. One morning, Grace came downstairs earlier than usual. She found Mrs. Agnes carrying a basket filled with vegetables from the garden. Grace quickly walked over. "Please let me help you." Mrs. Agnes smiled. "You don't have to. I want to." Grace gently took the basket from her hands. Together they carried it into the kitchen. Mrs. Agnes laughed. "Most people living in a house like this would expect everyone else to do the work." Grace smiled. "My parents taught me that helping others is never something to be ashamed of." Mrs. Agnes nodded proudly. "They raised you well." Grace's smile faded for a moment. "I wish they were still here." Mrs. Agnes gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "I believe they would be very proud of the woman you've become." Grace smiled again. "Thank you." That simple conversation stayed in Grace's heart for the rest of the day. She missed her parents every day, but hearing kind words about them brought her comfort. Grace's lessons became more challenging as the weeks passed. Miss Evelyn taught her reading, writing, mathematics, history, and science. Grace listened carefully during every lesson. She carried a small notebook wherever she went. Whenever she learned a new word, she wrote it down. Whenever she made a mistake, she corrected it without complaining. One afternoon, Miss Evelyn smiled as Grace finished solving a difficult math problem. "Excellent." Grace looked surprised. "I got it right?" "You did." Grace smiled proudly. "I've never had someone teach me like this before." Miss Evelyn nodded. "That's because you've always wanted to learn." Grace laughed softly. "I used to collect old books that my cousins threw away." "You taught yourself?" "I tried." Miss Evelyn looked amazed. "No wonder you learn so quickly." Grace felt happy. For the first time in her life, someone praised her for working hard instead of criticizing her. Daniel was very busy running his company. Some days he left early in the morning and returned after sunset. Even though his schedule was full, he always found time to ask Grace how her day had gone. One evening he came home carrying several shopping bags. Grace was sitting in the library reading a novel. She immediately stood. "Welcome back." Daniel smiled. "Thank you." Mrs. Agnes entered the room. "Dinner will be ready soon." Daniel nodded. Then he turned toward Grace. "I brought something for you." Grace looked confused. "For me?" Daniel handed her one of the bags. Inside were several new books. Grace carefully picked one up. It was a beautiful storybook with colorful pictures. Another book was a dictionary. There were also notebooks and pens. Grace looked at Daniel with shining eyes. "You remembered that I love books." Daniel smiled. "Of course." Grace hugged the books tightly. "Thank you. I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything." "But I want to." She smiled warmly. "Thank you for believing in me." Daniel looked at her quietly. He realized something. Grace never cared about expensive things. She became happiest over simple gifts that helped her learn. That made him admire her even more. As the days passed, Daniel and Grace slowly became good friends. After dinner, they often walked through the beautiful garden together. The colorful flowers bloomed along the stone paths, and the evening air was always cool and peaceful. One evening, Daniel pointed toward the sky. "Look." Grace looked up. The sunset painted the clouds orange, pink, and gold. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Daniel smiled. "Do you know something?" "What?" "When I was younger, I never noticed sunsets." Grace looked surprised. "Why?" "I was always busy. I thought making money was the most important thing." Grace listened quietly. Daniel continued. "My parents worked very hard. They built a successful business. When they passed away, I inherited everything." Grace's face became serious. "I'm sorry." Daniel smiled sadly. "I was 22. I thought if I worked harder than everyone else, I would never feel lonely." "Did it help?" Daniel looked at the colorful sky for a moment. "No. It only made me busier." Grace nodded. "My mother used to say that money can buy many things, but it cannot buy love." Daniel smiled. She was a wise woman. Grace smiled proudly. She really was. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. The quiet felt comfortable. Neither one needed to fill every silence with words. One Saturday morning, Daniel decided to take Grace to a nearby park. Grace had never visited such a place before. Families were walking together. Children laughed while flying colorful kites. Some people rode bicycles. Others enjoyed picnics under large trees. Grace smiled brightly. "It feels so peaceful." Daniel handed her an ice cream. Grace looked surprised. "I've never tasted one before." Daniel laughed. "Then today is your lucky day." Grace carefully took a small bite. Her eyes became wide. "It's cold." Daniel laughed even harder. "But do you like it?" Grace nodded quickly. "It's delicious." They both laughed. For the first time in many years, Grace laughed without fear. She wasn't worried about making mistakes. She wasn't afraid someone would yell at her. She simply enjoyed the moment. As they continued walking, they noticed a little boy crying near a bench. He looked frightened. Grace immediately walked over. She knelt beside him. "Hello." The little boy wiped his tears. "I can't find my mommy." Grace smiled gently. "Don't worry. We'll help you." Daniel contacted one of the park security officers. Within a few minutes, an announcement was made. Soon, a worried woman came running toward them. "There you are." She hugged her son tightly. The little boy pointed at Grace. "She helped me." The woman smiled gratefully. "Thank you so much." Grace smiled. "I'm just glad he's safe." After they walked away, Daniel looked at Grace. "You didn't hesitate." Grace shrugged. "He was scared. I couldn't ignore him." Daniel smiled. "That's one of the things I admire most about you." Grace looked embarrassed. "I only did what anyone should do." Daniel shook his head. "Not everyone would." Grace didn't know what to say. She simply smiled. That evening, Daniel invited Grace to help prepare dinner with Mrs. Agnes. Although there were cooks available, Grace enjoyed learning new recipes. As they chopped vegetables together, Daniel accidentally dropped a tomato onto the floor. Grace laughed. I thought billionaires were supposed to be good at everything. Daniel picked up the tomato and laughed too. Running a company doesn't teach you how to cook. Mrs. Agnes laughed from across the kitchen. I've never seen you spend this much time in the kitchen before, Mr. Daniel. Daniel smiled. I'm learning. Grace handed him another tomato. Try again. He carefully sliced it. Grace clapped playfully. Much better. The three of them laughed together. The large house, once quiet and lonely, was now filled with warmth and happiness. Later that night, Grace stood on the balcony looking at the stars. Daniel joined her. You always look at the stars. Grace nodded. My parents and I used to do this. My father would point out different stars. My mother would tell me stories. Daniel smiled. They must have loved you very much. They did. Grace looked up at the night sky. I still talk to them sometimes. What do you tell them? She smiled softly. I tell them about my day. I tell them how grateful I am. I tell them about you. Daniel looked surprised. About me? Grace laughed. Of course. I tell them someone very kind saved me. Daniel smiled quietly. I'm glad we met. Grace looked at him. So am I. Neither of them realized that their friendship had become something much deeper. They simply enjoyed spending time together. A few days later, Daniel attended an important business meeting. One of his business partners, Mr. Collins, noticed that Daniel seemed happier than usual. You've been smiling a lot lately, Mr. Collins said. Daniel laughed. Have I? Yes. Something good must have happened. Daniel thought about Grace. He remembered her excitement when she received new books. He remembered her laughter in the park. He remembered her kindness toward the lost little boy. He smiled again. I've made a very good friend. Mr. Collins nodded knowingly. A true friend is hard to find. Daniel agreed. It certainly is. Meanwhile, Grace continued studying every day. One afternoon, Miss Evelyn gave her a short writing assignment. She asked Grace to write about the happiest moment of her life. Grace thought carefully before putting her pencil on the paper. She wrote, The happiest day of my life was not the day I entered a beautiful house. It was the day someone looked at me and saw more than a poor orphan. Mr. Daniel believed I deserved kindness when he had no reason to help me. He reminded me that good people still exist in the world. Because of him, I have hope again. When Miss Evelyn finished reading it, she smiled. You write from your heart. Grace nodded. I only wrote the truth. That evening, Miss Evelyn quietly showed Daniel the assignment. Daniel read every word slowly. When he finished, he folded the paper carefully. He felt something warm grow inside his heart. Grace's kindness, honesty, and grateful spirit had touched him more deeply than he wanted to admit. As he looked out the window toward the garden where Grace was reading beneath a tree, he smiled to himself. He realized he was no longer looking forward to seeing Grace simply because she was his friend. Every conversation with her made his day brighter. Every smile she gave him stayed in his mind long after she had walked away. Without fully understanding when it had happened, a simple friendship had begun to blossom into something far more beautiful. Neither of them knew it yet, but love was quietly finding its way into both of their hearts. Several months passed after Grace arrived at Daniel's guest house. The frightened young woman who had once wandered alone on a dusty road had changed in many wonderful ways. She smiled more often. She laughed freely. She had gained confidence through her studies and had learned many new things. Although she now wore beautiful clothes and lived in a comfortable home, one thing about Grace never changed. She remained humble. Every morning, she greeted everyone with a warm smile. Good morning, Mrs. Agnes. Good morning, Miss Evelyn. Good morning, Daniel. Her kindness filled the house with warmth. Mrs. Agnes often smiled whenever she watched Grace. One morning, she quietly said to Daniel, She has a special heart. Daniel nodded. I know. Money changes many people, Mrs. Agnes continued. But Grace is still the same young woman who first walked through that door. Daniel smiled. That's one of the things I admire most about her. Mrs. Agnes looked at him carefully. Only admire? Daniel looked away with a shy smile. I'm not sure anymore. Mrs. Agnes laughed softly. I think you know exactly how you feel. Daniel smiled but said nothing. Deep inside he knew she was right. He was falling in love. One afternoon, Grace finished her lessons earlier than usual. She walked into the garden carrying one of the books Daniel had given her. The flowers were blooming beautifully. Butterflies flew from one flower to another. The air smelled fresh after a light morning rain. Grace sat on a wooden bench beneath a large tree and began reading. A few minutes later, Daniel returned from work. He noticed Grace sitting peacefully in the garden. Instead of going inside the house, he walked toward her. "What are you reading?" he asked. Grace looked up and smiled. "It's a story about a young teacher who helps children in a poor village." Daniel sat beside her. "Do you like it?" "I do." She closed the book gently. "I've been thinking about something." "What is it?" Grace looked toward the colorful flowers. "When I finish studying, I'd like to help children who don't have the chance to go to school." Daniel smiled. "I think you'd be wonderful at that." Grace looked surprised. "You really think so?" "I know so. You've never forgotten how difficult your own life was." Grace nodded. "I don't want anyone to feel the way I felt." Daniel admired her even more. Many people dreamed about becoming rich. Grace dreamed about helping others. Her heart was filled with kindness. A few days later, Daniel invited Grace to visit one of the community centers his company supported. The center helped children from poor families. Grace eagerly accepted. As soon as they arrived, dozens of children ran around the playground laughing. Some were reading books. Others were drawing pictures. A little girl accidentally fell while running. Grace hurried over. "Are you all right?" The little girl nodded, although tears filled her eyes. Grace gently helped her stand. "There you go." The little girl smiled. "Thank you." Grace dusted off the girl's dress and smiled warmly. "You're very brave." Soon several children gathered around Grace. "Will you read us a story?" one little boy asked. Grace looked at Daniel. He smiled. "I think they already like you." Grace laughed. She sat beneath a tree while the children gathered around her. She opened a storybook and began reading aloud. She changed her voice for each character. The children laughed during the funny parts and listened carefully during the exciting parts. Even Daniel found himself smiling as he watched her. One of the teachers quietly walked over. "Is she your wife?" Daniel looked surprised. "No." The teacher smiled knowingly. "I thought she was. You two look happy together." Daniel laughed softly. "We're good friends." The teacher smiled. "Perhaps for now." Daniel looked toward Grace again. His heart beat a little faster. Maybe the teacher had noticed something he had been trying to ignore. That evening, after returning home, Daniel couldn't stop thinking about Grace. Everywhere he looked, he remembered something she had said or done. He remembered the way she comforted the crying little girl. He remembered the excitement on the children's faces as she read to them. He remembered how naturally she cared for everyone around her. He walked into his home office and sat quietly. His assistant, Michael, knocked on the door. "Sir, come in." Michael entered carrying several business files. "These contracts need your signature." Daniel signed them absent-mindedly. Michael looked at him curiously. "You seem distracted." Daniel smiled. "Do I?" "A little." Daniel leaned back in his chair. "Michael." "Yes, sir?" "Have you ever met someone who completely changes the way you see life?" Michael smiled. "My wife." Daniel laughed. "I thought you might say that." Michael placed the files on the desk. "Why do you ask?" Daniel hesitated. "I think I've fallen in love." Michael smiled broadly. "I was wondering how long it would take." Daniel looked surprised. "You already knew?" Michael laughed. "Sir, everyone noticed. The way you smile when Grace enters a room. The way you always ask how her lessons are going. The way you make time for dinner even on your busiest days." Daniel shook his head, smiling. "Was I really that obvious?" Michael nodded. "Very." Daniel looked out the window. "But what if she doesn't feel the same?" Michael smiled. You'll never know unless you ask. Meanwhile, Grace was also feeling confused. That night, she sat with Mrs. Agnes in the kitchen while helping bake bread. Mrs. Agnes noticed Grace smiling to herself. "What are you thinking about?" Grace laughed softly. "Nothing." Mrs. Agnes raised an eyebrow. "I don't believe that." Grace blushed. "I've just been thinking." "About Daniel?" Grace looked surprised. "How did you know?" Mrs. Agnes smiled. "A woman notices these things." Grace lowered her eyes. "I don't know what's happening. I feel happy whenever he's around. I look forward to hearing his footsteps when he comes home." Mrs. Agnes smiled warmly. "And," Grace sighed, "but he's successful. He's handsome. He's a billionaire. I'm just an orphan." Mrs. Agnes gently took Grace's hand. "My dear, a person's value isn't measured by money. Daniel doesn't care where you came from. He sees the person you are." Grace smiled softly. "I hope you're right." A week later, Daniel made a decision. He wanted to tell Grace how he truly felt. He planned a quiet evening at a beautiful lakeside restaurant just outside the city. The restaurant overlooked calm water surrounded by tall trees. It was peaceful and private. When Daniel invited Grace, she smiled. "I'd love to go." On the evening of the dinner, Grace wore a simple light blue dress. Her hair was neatly styled. She looked elegant without trying to. When Daniel saw her, he smiled. "You look beautiful." Grace blushed. "Thank you. You look very handsome too." Daniel laughed. "Thank you." They drove to the restaurant together. The sun was beginning to set. Golden light reflected across the peaceful lake. Birds flew low over the water. Soft music played in the background. Grace looked around. "This place is beautiful. I thought you'd like it." They enjoyed a delicious dinner while talking about many things. Grace shared funny stories from her lessons with Miss Evelyn. Daniel talked about his childhood. For the first time, he told Grace how lonely he had felt after losing his parents. Grace listened carefully. "I'm sorry you went through that." Daniel smiled sadly. "I buried myself in work. I thought success would fill the emptiness." "Did it?" He shook his head. "No." "What changed?" Daniel looked directly into her eyes. "You." Grace's heart skipped a beat. Daniel took a slow breath. "Grace, I've wanted to tell you something for a long time." She looked at him quietly. "When I first met you beside that road, I thought I was simply helping someone. But over the past months, you've changed my life. You reminded me to slow down. You reminded me that kindness matters. You filled my home with laughter again." He smiled gently. "I love you." Grace stared at him. Tears slowly filled her eyes. Daniel continued. "I don't care that you grew up poor. I don't care that you're an orphan. I love your kindness. I love your courage. I love the way you care for others. I love the woman you've become." Grace could no longer hold back her tears. She smiled through them. "I've been trying not to fall in love with you." Daniel looked surprised. "You have." She nodded. "I kept telling myself someone like you could never love someone like me." Daniel smiled. "I've never wanted anyone else." Grace laughed softly through her tears. "I love you too." The words filled Daniel's heart with joy. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. They simply smiled at each other. Then Daniel reached into his jacket pocket. He carefully removed a small velvet box. Grace's eyes widened. Daniel slowly opened it. Inside was a beautiful diamond ring. He stood beside the table. Then he knelt on one knee. "Grace, you've brought happiness back into my life. You've shown me what true love looks like. Will you marry me?" Grace covered her mouth in surprise. Happy tears rolled down her cheeks. People at nearby tables quietly watched the beautiful moment. Grace nodded. "Yes." Daniel smiled. She laughed through her tears. "Yes, Daniel. I'll marry you." Daniel gently placed the ring on her finger. It fit perfectly. The restaurant guests began clapping. Some smiled. Others wiped away tears. Grace looked at the sparkling ring. Then she looked at Daniel. "I still feel like I'm dreaming." Daniel gently held her hands. This is real. You'll never have to face life alone again. Grace smiled. And neither will you. As the last light of the sun disappeared beyond the lake, the two of them stood together, hand in hand. The frightened orphan who had once believed no one wanted her had found a man who loved her with all his heart. The lonely billionaire who thought success could replace happiness had discovered that the greatest treasure in life was not wealth. It was true love. Their beautiful journey together had only just begun, and an even greater surprise awaited them when they returned to Grace's village. The morning after Daniel proposed, Grace woke up earlier than usual. For a few moments, she lay quietly in bed, staring at the ceiling. Then she remembered everything that had happened the night before. Daniel had asked her to marry him. She slowly lifted her left hand and smiled as the diamond ring sparkled in the morning sunlight. Tears filled her eyes again. Just a few months earlier, she had been sleeping under a tree with nowhere to go. Now she was engaged to a kind man who truly loved her. She closed her eyes and whispered a prayer. Thank you, God. Thank you for changing my life. Help me to always stay humble and never forget where I came from. She carefully got out of bed and walked downstairs. Mrs. Agnes was already in the kitchen preparing breakfast. The moment she saw Grace, she smiled knowingly. So, she said with a grin, how does it feel to be a bride-to-be? Grace laughed shyly. It still doesn't feel real. Mrs. Agnes hugged her warmly. I'm so happy for you. Thank you. You deserve every bit of happiness that is coming your way. Grace smiled. I hope I can make Daniel as happy as he has made me. Mrs. Agnes nodded. I have no doubt that you will. Just then, Daniel walked into the kitchen. He smiled the moment he saw Grace. Good morning. Grace smiled back. Good morning. Neither of them could stop smiling. Mrs. Agnes laughed. I think this house is going to be filled with smiles for a very long time. Everyone laughed together. The house felt brighter than ever. Later that morning, Daniel invited Grace into his study. He wanted them to begin planning their future together. Several notebooks lay on the large wooden desk. Daniel pulled out a chair for Grace. Please sit. Grace sat down. Daniel smiled. We have a lot to plan. Grace looked nervous. I've never planned a wedding before. Daniel laughed softly. Neither have I. They both laughed. Daniel opened one notebook. First, I want to know what kind of wedding you would like. Grace thought quietly. She looked out the window for a moment before answering. I don't need the biggest wedding. Daniel listened carefully. I just want everyone there to celebrate love. I want children to laugh. I want families to smile. I want it to be joyful. Daniel smiled. That's exactly what I want too. Grace looked at him. And I don't want people to think I'm marrying you because you're rich. Daniel gently reached across the table and held her hand. Anyone who knows you would never think that. Grace smiled. I hope so. Daniel squeezed her hand gently. Our wedding will reflect who we are. Simple where it should be. Beautiful because of the people. Grace nodded happily. A few days later, Daniel introduced Grace to his closest friends. They gathered for dinner at one of his homes. Grace felt nervous as she entered the dining room. Daniel noticed. You'll be fine. I've never met people like this before. They're just friends. Soon everyone arrived. The first was James, Daniel's oldest friend from college. Next came Olivia, who had known Daniel's family for many years. There was also Michael, Daniel's loyal assistant, and his wife, Rebecca. Daniel smiled. Everyone, I'd like you to meet Grace. Grace smiled politely. It's nice to meet all of you. James shook her hand. We've heard wonderful things about you. Grace laughed. I hope only good things. Olivia smiled warmly. Daniel hasn't smiled this much in years. Grace looked at Daniel. Really? Michael laughed. It's true. He used to spend every waking hour thinking about work. Rebecca nodded. Now he actually takes time to enjoy life. Daniel smiled sheepishly. I didn't know everyone was paying so much attention. Everyone laughed. Throughout dinner, Grace listened more than she spoke. Whenever someone asked her a question, she answered honestly. She talked about her love of books. She spoke about wanting to help children one day. She shared how grateful she was for the opportunity to continue her education. By the end of the evening, everyone admired her. As they prepared to leave, Olivia quietly whispered to Daniel, "You found someone very special." Daniel smiled proudly. "I know." The next week, wedding preparations officially began. A wedding planner named Mrs. Bennett visited the house. She brought books filled with ideas for flowers, decorations, invitations, and cakes. Grace looked overwhelmed. "There are so many choices." Mrs. Bennett smiled kindly. "That's perfectly normal." Daniel laughed. "I think we both need your help." They spent hours discussing different ideas. Grace loved white roses because they reminded her of peace. Daniel suggested adding blue flowers since blue was Grace's favorite color. Grace smiled. "I like that." They chose soft colors that made everything look bright and elegant. When it was time to choose music, Grace smiled. "I want songs that make people happy." Daniel nodded. "No sad songs." Mrs. Bennett laughed. "I think this will be one joyful wedding." A few days later, Grace visited a bridal shop for the first time. Mrs. Agnes, Olivia, and Rebecca accompanied her. The shop was filled with beautiful wedding dresses. Grace stood silently, looking around in amazement. "They're all so beautiful." The shop owner smiled. "I think we have the perfect dress for you." Several dresses were brought for Grace to try. The first was elegant but too heavy. The second was beautiful but did not fit perfectly. Then the owner brought out another gown. It was simple yet graceful. The fabric flowed gently to the floor. Tiny pearls decorated the sleeves. Grace stepped out of the dressing room. Everyone became quiet. Mrs. Agnes smiled with tears in her eyes. "You look beautiful." Olivia nodded. "Absolutely beautiful." Rebecca smiled. "Daniel is going to be speechless." Grace slowly turned toward the mirror. She hardly recognized herself. For a moment, she remembered the torn dresses she used to wear in her uncle's house. She remembered washing clothes until her hands hurt. She remembered sleeping on a mat in the kitchen. Now she stood before the mirror dressed as a bride. A tear rolled down her cheek. Mrs. Agnes gently hugged her. "What is it?" Grace smiled through her tears. "I was just thinking about how much my life has changed." Mrs. Agnes nodded. "You've been blessed." Grace quietly whispered, "I'll never forget where I came from." Meanwhile, Daniel was busy making his own preparations. He visited a tailor to be fitted for his wedding suit. James accompanied him. As Daniel stood before the mirror, James smiled. "You look nervous." Daniel laughed. "I am. I've spoken to thousands of people during business meetings. But somehow this feels different." James smiled. "Because this one matters the most." Daniel nodded. "It does." James looked at him seriously. "Grace loves you for who you are. You don't have to impress her." Daniel smiled. "I know. I just want everything to be perfect." James laughed. "Marriage isn't about perfection. It's about love." Daniel smiled thoughtfully. "I'll remember that." As news of the engagement spread, newspapers and websites began talking about it. Many people were curious. Who was the young woman Daniel King had chosen to marry? Some reporters tried to learn more about Grace. A few discovered that she had grown up as an orphan. Unfortunately, not everyone was kind. One television program suggested that Grace was only interested in Daniel's wealth. When Grace accidentally saw the report, she became quiet. Daniel noticed immediately. "What happened?" Grace showed him the news. "They don't even know me." Daniel gently took the phone from her hands. "Don't let strangers tell you who you are." Grace sighed. "What if people believe them?" Daniel smiled gently. "The people who matter know the truth." Mrs. Agnes joined them. "My dear, kindness always speaks louder than gossip." Grace smiled. "I'll try to remember that." Daniel looked into her eyes. "I know your heart. That's all that matters." Grace felt comforted by his words. She realized that no matter what others said, Daniel trusted her completely. That trust meant more to her than anything. One Saturday afternoon, Grace asked Daniel if they could visit the Children's Community Center again. "I'd like to spend some time with them." Daniel smiled. "I was hoping you'd ask." They spent the afternoon reading stories, playing games, and sharing lunch with the children. When the children learned that Grace was getting married, they became excited. One little girl hugged Grace tightly. "Can I come to your wedding?" Grace laughed. "Of course." Another little boy smiled. "Will there be cake?" Daniel laughed. "There will be plenty of cake." The children cheered loudly. As Grace watched them laughing together, she felt something warm in her heart. She quietly turned to Daniel. "Can we do something special? What do you have in mind?" "I don't want our wedding to be only about us." Daniel smiled. "I was thinking the same thing." Grace's eyes lit up. "Really?" Daniel nodded. "Instead of asking for expensive gifts, let's ask our guests to donate books, school supplies, and toys for children who need them." Grace smiled brightly. "I love that idea." Together they began making plans. Their wedding would not only celebrate their love, it would also bring joy to many children. That evening, they returned home and sat together in the peaceful garden. The sun slowly disappeared behind the trees, painting the sky with beautiful shades of orange and pink. Grace rested her head gently against Daniel's shoulder. "I've been thinking about something." Daniel smiled. "What is it?" "I want to visit my village before the wedding." Daniel looked at her. "To see your uncle?" Grace nodded slowly. "I don't know how they'll react. I'm still a little afraid." Daniel gently held her hand. "You won't be alone this time." Grace looked at him. "I know." Daniel smiled. "We'll go together. And we'll arrive in a way no one will ever forget." Grace laughed softly. "I don't need to impress anyone." Daniel smiled. "No, but I want the people who once looked down on you to see how valuable you truly are." Grace squeezed his hand. "As long as you're beside me, I'll be brave." Daniel smiled. "I'll always be beside you." As the stars began to appear above them, neither of them realized that their visit to Grace's village would become the talk of the entire community. The people who had once pitied the poor orphan would soon witness a moment so unforgettable that it would be remembered for many years to come. The weeks passed quickly, and before Grace realized it, only a few days remained before the wedding. Every part of the ceremony had been carefully planned. The invitations had been sent. The flowers had been chosen. The wedding dress was ready. Even the children from the community center could not stop talking about the big day. But there was one thing Grace still wanted to do before she became Daniel's wife. She wanted to return to the village where she had grown up. Not because she wanted revenge. Not because she wanted to show off. She simply wanted to close the painful chapter of her life and move forward with peace in her heart. One evening, she sat with Daniel in the garden as they watched the sunset. The gentle breeze moved the flowers, and birds flew back to their nests. Grace held Daniel's hand. "Are you sure we should go?" she asked quietly. Daniel smiled. "I've never been more sure of anything." She looked down. "I'm nervous." "I know. What if seeing my uncle brings back all the pain?" Daniel gently squeezed her hand. "Then I'll be there to remind you that those painful days are over." Grace smiled softly. "You always know what to say." Daniel laughed. "I've had a good teacher." Grace looked surprised. "Who?" "You." She laughed and lightly nudged his shoulder. They sat quietly for a few moments before Daniel spoke again. "I've made a few arrangements." Grace looked at him curiously. "What kind of arrangements?" Daniel smiled mischievously. "You'll see tomorrow." The next morning, Grace woke up to the sound of birds singing outside her window. She looked at the ring on her finger and smiled. Today was the day she would return to her village. She knelt beside her bed. "Dear God," she prayed softly, "please help me forgive those who hurt me. Give me peace in my heart. Help me to show kindness instead of anger." After praying, she got dressed. She chose a simple but elegant royal blue dress that Mrs. Agnes had helped her pick. The dress was beautiful without being flashy. She wore a pair of comfortable white shoes and a small necklace Daniel had given her. When she looked into the mirror, she smiled. She still saw the same grace inside. Only her circumstances had changed. Downstairs, Mrs. Agnes greeted her warmly. "You look lovely." "Thank you." Mrs. Agnes hugged her. "I'm proud of you." Grace smiled. "I couldn't have come this far without all of you." Just then Daniel entered the dining room. He was wearing a neatly tailored navy blue suit. He smiled the moment he saw Grace. "You look beautiful." Grace smiled shyly. "So do you." After breakfast, Daniel looked toward the front door. "Ready." Grace took a deep breath. "Ready." When they stepped outside, Grace stopped walking. Parked in front of the house were several shiny black luxury SUVs. Behind them was a beautiful white Rolls-Royce decorated with fresh white flowers. Grace looked at Daniel with surprise. "What is all this?" Daniel smiled. "I thought we should travel together." Grace laughed. "I think one car would have been enough." Daniel grinned. "Probably." Michael, Daniel's assistant, walked over. "Everything is ready, sir." Daniel nodded. "Thank you." Grace quietly whispered to Daniel, "This is too much." Daniel smiled gently. "I didn't arrange this to impress people. I arranged it because today is important." Grace nodded. She understood. The convoy slowly drove out of the city. As they traveled toward the village, Grace watched the scenery change. Tall buildings slowly disappeared. Green farms replaced busy streets. Small roadside shops appeared once again. The closer they came, the faster Grace's heart beat. She recognized the winding road. She recognized the old bridge. She recognized the mango trees she had walked past so many times as a child. Memories came flooding back. She remembered carrying heavy buckets of water. She remembered crying beneath the tree after being sent away. She remembered praying for a better life. Daniel noticed she had become quiet. He gently held her hand. "You don't have to be afraid." Grace smiled weakly. "I'm trying. You've already shown more courage than you realize." She nodded. "Thank you." Meanwhile, back in the village, it was an ordinary morning. Farmers were returning from their fields. Women were arranging vegetables in the market. Children were chasing one another through the dusty streets. Old Mama Rose sat outside her house peeling cassava. Suddenly, she heard the sound of engines. She looked up. One black SUV drove into the village. Then another. Then another. Soon the entire convoy slowly entered the main road. Children stopped playing. Women looked up from their market stalls. Men put down their farming tools. What is happening? Who is coming? I've never seen cars like these before. The convoy moved slowly through the village, attracting everyone's attention. Children ran behind the vehicles, laughing excitedly. Look at the shiny cars. Maybe it's a government official. No, maybe it's a famous person. Within minutes, almost everyone in the village had gathered along the roadside. Even Uncle Peter heard the commotion. He stepped outside his house with Aunt Martha, David, and Sarah. "What is all this noise?" he asked. No one knew. The white Rolls-Royce finally stopped in the center of the village. The driver stepped out and respectfully opened the rear door. Everyone became silent. Polished black shoe appeared first. Then Daniel stepped out of the car. His neatly tailored suit, calm smile, and confident posture immediately caught everyone's attention. People whispered among themselves, "Who is he? He looks important. He must be very rich." Daniel walked around the car. Then he gently opened the other door. Grace slowly stepped out. For a moment, the entire village stood completely still. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. The young woman standing beside the handsome billionaire looked familiar. Very familiar. Old Mama Rose dropped the basket she was holding. Her eyes filled with tears. Grace! One by one, the villagers recognized her. It's Grace. The orphan girl. Is that really her? I can't believe it. The same young woman who had once walked barefoot through the village carrying heavy buckets now stood gracefully beside a billionaire. She looked confident, healthy, happy. Her beautiful blue dress moved gently in the breeze. She smiled warmly at the people around her. There was no anger in her eyes, only kindness. Children who had known her when they were younger smiled and waved. Grace waved back. "It really is Grace," someone whispered. "She looks like a queen." Mama Rose hurried toward her. The moment Grace saw the elderly woman, her eyes filled with tears. "Mama Rose, my child." They embraced tightly. Mama Rose cried openly. "I prayed for you every day." Grace hugged her even tighter. "Thank you for being kind to me when no one else was." Mama Rose looked at her with pride. "Look at you. I always knew God had wonderful plans for your life." Grace smiled through her tears. "I'll never forget the bread and water you gave me." Mama Rose gently touched Grace's face. "You remembered? I'll remember it forever." Daniel watched quietly, smiling. He finally understood just how much that small act of kindness had meant to Grace. The villagers slowly gathered around them. Some welcomed Grace warmly. Others looked embarrassed. Many remembered watching silently when she had been thrown out of her uncle's house. One elderly man stepped forward. "We should have helped you." Grace smiled gently. "The past is behind us." A woman lowered her head. "We're sorry." Grace nodded kindly. "I've already forgiven everyone." Her words surprised many people. If they had been treated the way Grace had been treated, they would have returned with anger. Instead, Grace returned with peace. Daniel admired her even more. Then Grace slowly turned toward the familiar house where she had spent so many painful years. The gate was exactly as she remembered. The walls looked older now. The mango tree still stood in the corner of the yard. Her heart beat faster. Daniel gently reached for her hand. "Are you ready?" Grace took a deep breath. She looked at him and smiled. "Yes." Together, they began walking toward the house. The villagers quietly followed behind them. No one wanted to miss what would happen next. Inside the compound, Uncle Peter stood frozen. Beside him, Aunt Martha stared at Grace in complete disbelief. David and Sarah could hardly recognize the cousin they had once mocked. The poor orphan they had chased from their home had returned. Not alone, but beside one of the wealthiest and most respected men in the country. A heavy silence filled the air. Everyone waited. No one spoke. The moment Grace and Daniel reached the gate, Uncle Peter slowly stepped forward. His face showed shock, shame, and regret. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Grace looked at the man who had raised her, the man who had also caused her so much pain. She felt many emotions at once. Sadness, relief, compassion. She knew the conversation that was about to begin would change all of their lives forever. A heavy silence filled the air as Grace and Daniel stood before the gate of Uncle Peter's house. The entire village had gathered behind them. No one spoke. Even the children, who had been laughing moments earlier, became quiet. Everyone wanted to hear what would happen next. Uncle Peter stood frozen in the middle of the compound. His face had turned pale. He looked at Grace again and again, as if he could not believe she was really standing there. The young woman he had thrown out of his house with only a small cloth bag had returned looking happy, confident, and respected. Beside her stood Daniel, a handsome billionaire dressed in an elegant navy blue suit. The shiny luxury cars parked outside the compound reminded everyone that Grace's life had completely changed. Aunt Martha stood behind her husband. For the first time in many years, she had nothing to say. David and Sarah looked at one another nervously. Neither of them dared to meet Grace's eyes. Grace took a slow, deep breath. Many painful memories rushed into her mind. She remembered standing at the same gate with tears running down her face. She remembered begging Uncle Peter not to send her away. She remembered carrying her small bag as the gate slammed shut behind her. She remembered sleeping under the tree that night, wondering if anyone cared whether she lived or died. Her heart became heavy. Daniel gently squeezed her hand. Grace looked at him. He smiled softly. "You don't have to be afraid." His calm voice gave her strength. She smiled and nodded. "I'm all right." Daniel stayed beside her. He knew this moment belonged to Grace. She had to face her past in her own way. After what felt like forever, Uncle Peter finally found his voice. "Grace." His voice trembled. Is that really you?" Grace smiled politely. "Yes, Uncle. I came to visit. Uncle Peter looked at her carefully. She spoke with the same gentle voice she had always used. There was no anger, no hatred, only calmness, that made him feel even more ashamed. Aunt Martha slowly stepped forward. She looked at Grace's beautiful dress, her sparkling engagement ring, and the expensive cars parked outside. Then she looked down. She could not find the courage to speak. Old Mama Rose stood among the villagers, watching everything with tears in her eyes. She silently prayed that peace would fill everyone's hearts. After a few moments, Daniel smiled politely. "Good afternoon." Uncle Peter quickly nodded. "Gee, good afternoon. My name is Daniel King. I am Grace's fiancé." The villagers whispered excitedly. "So it's true. She really is marrying him. A billionaire. I've never seen anything like this." Uncle Peter swallowed hard. He looked from Daniel to Grace, then back again. You're getting married?" Grace smiled. "Yes. Our wedding is in a few days." The words felt like a sharp reminder of everything he had done. Instead of preparing Grace for marriage like a loving father would have done, he had driven her away. Tears slowly filled his eyes. He lowered his head. I don't know what to say." Grace remained silent. She simply waited. Uncle Peter took another slow step forward. His shoulders dropped. He no longer looked proud. He no longer looked angry. He looked like a man carrying years of regret. "My child." He paused. "I treated you very badly." The villagers became even quieter. No one had ever heard Uncle Peter admit he was wrong. He continued speaking. "When your parents died, I promised I would take care of you. But instead," he wiped his eyes, "I failed them." Grace listened quietly. "I allowed my wife to treat you like a servant. I watched you work from morning until night. I never asked if you were tired. I never asked if you were happy. I even stopped you from going to school." His voice broke. "And then," he looked toward the ground, "I threw you out of this house. I still remember the way you begged me not to send you away. I ignored your tears." He covered his face with both hands. "I have regretted that day ever since." Aunt Martha began crying too. She slowly walked toward Grace. "My dear, I was cruel to you. I shouted at you. I blamed you for things you never did." Grace looked at her quietly. Aunt Martha's voice became softer. "The truth is, it wasn't you who broke the flower vase." Everyone looked at Sarah. Sarah immediately burst into tears. "I'm sorry." She stepped forward, crying. "I broke it. It was an accident. I was too scared to tell the truth. I let them blame you." Grace looked at her younger cousin. Sarah could barely speak through her tears. "I'm sorry. I've wanted to tell the truth for so long." David also stepped forward. "I wasn't kind to you either. I laughed at you. I treated you badly. I'm sorry." Grace looked at all of them. For years she had imagined this moment. She had often wondered what she would say if they ever apologized. Now the moment had come. The whole village waited for her answer. Some expected her to remind them of everything they had done. Others expected her to walk away without saying a word. Instead, Grace smiled gently. "I accept your apologies." Everyone looked surprised. She continued speaking. "My parents taught me something before they died. They always said that forgiveness brings peace. I've carried those words in my heart." She looked at Uncle Peter. "You hurt me deeply. There were many nights when I cried because I felt unwanted." She looked at Aunt Martha. "There were days I wondered why I was treated differently from David and Sarah." Then she smiled. "But if I hold on to anger forever, I'll never truly be free." She took a deep breath. "So today, I forgive all of you." Many of the villagers wiped tears from their eyes. Mama Rose smiled through her tears. "I knew she would choose kindness." Daniel looked at Grace with admiration. He had always known she had a good heart. But hearing her forgive the people who had caused her so much pain made him love her even more. Uncle Peter suddenly fell to his knees. The villagers gasped. He looked up at Grace with tears running freely down his face. "Please forgive me. I don't deserve your kindness. Grace quickly stepped forward. Please stand up. No, I won't stand until you forgive me. Grace gently held his arm. I already have. She helped him to his feet. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Uncle Peter hugged her tightly. I'm so sorry. Grace hugged him back. I know. Many people began clapping. Others cried openly. It was a moment the village would never forget. Daniel smiled warmly. I'm grateful that today ended with forgiveness. The villagers nodded. One elderly man stepped forward. This village has learned something important today. Another woman agreed. Kindness is stronger than revenge. Daniel looked around at everyone. I'd like to say something. The crowd became quiet. When I first met Grace, she was sitting alone under a tree. I didn't know her story, but I saw kindness in her eyes. Over the past months, I've learned that true beauty comes from a person's heart. He smiled at Grace. She could have returned here with anger. Instead, she returned with love. He turned back to the villagers. That's the kind of woman I'm proud to marry. Everyone applauded. Grace smiled shyly. Daniel continued. Our wedding will take place this weekend. We would be honored if all of you came. The villagers looked at one another in surprise. You mean, all of us? Daniel smiled. Yes, everyone. The children jumped with excitement. We're going to a wedding. Old Mama Rose laughed happily. I've never been invited to such a grand celebration. Grace smiled. I want all of you there. You've all been part of my journey. Then she looked at Uncle Peter. I'd like you to come too. Uncle Peter wiped away fresh tears. It would be an honor. Grace smiled. And after the wedding? Daniel looked at her, curious. She smiled back. I'd like us to visit this village often. Daniel nodded immediately. I'd like that too. The villagers smiled. For the first time in many years, the village felt united. The pain of the past had been replaced by hope for the future. As the sun slowly began to set, Grace stood outside the house that had once been the place of her greatest sorrow. This time, she did not leave with tears. She left with peace in her heart, the love of the man beside her, and the respect of an entire village. Everyone watched as Daniel gently opened the door of the white Rolls-Royce for her. Grace smiled, took one last look at the village, and waved. The convoy slowly drove away as the villagers continued waving until the cars disappeared down the dusty road. Long after they were gone, people remained standing together, talking about what they had witnessed. They all agreed on one thing. The poor orphan girl had not returned to show everyone how rich she had become. She had returned to show them how powerful forgiveness could be. And only a few days later, the village would gather once again. Not for sadness, but for the joyful wedding of Grace and Daniel, a celebration that would mark the beginning of a beautiful new chapter in their lives. The morning of Grace and Daniel's wedding finally arrived. The sun rose slowly over the city, filling the sky with soft shades of orange and gold. It was a beautiful day, as if nature itself had decided to celebrate with them. Grace woke up early. For a few moments, she sat quietly on the edge of her bed, looking out the window. The garden below was decorated with fresh flowers, and colorful ribbons moved gently in the morning breeze. She smiled. This is the day, she whispered. She folded her hands and closed her eyes. Dear God, thank you for bringing me this far. Thank you for giving me another chance at life. Thank you for Daniel, Mrs. Agnes, and everyone who has shown me kindness. Please bless our marriage and help us always love each other, no matter what happens. When she finished praying, there was a gentle knock on her door. Come in, Grace said. Mrs. Agnes entered with a bright smile. Good morning, beautiful bride. Grace laughed softly. Good morning. Mrs. Agnes walked over and hugged her tightly. I can hardly believe today is your wedding day. Neither can I. Mrs. Agnes looked at Grace with proud eyes. The little girl who came here carrying one small bag has become a confident young woman. Grace smiled. I couldn't have done it without all of you. Mrs. Agnes gently wiped away a tear. We only opened the door. You walked through it with courage. A few minutes later, Olivia and Rebecca arrived. Both women hugged Grace warmly. "Ready?" Olivia asked. Grace smiled nervously. "I think so." Rebecca laughed. "It's normal to be nervous. We'll help you." Soon the room became lively. The hairstylist arrived. The makeup artist prepared her brushes. Laughter filled the room as everyone helped Grace get ready. They talked about funny memories. They laughed about Daniel trying to cook in the kitchen. Grace smiled as she remembered him dropping tomatoes on the floor. "I wonder if he's nervous," she said. Olivia laughed. "I promise you he's more nervous than you are." Across the city, Daniel was also getting ready. James stood beside him as the tailor made the final adjustments to his black tuxedo. Daniel looked into the mirror. He took a deep breath. James smiled. "You look like a man who's about to make the best decision of his life." Daniel laughed. "I hope I don't forget my vows." "You won't." Michael walked into the room. "Everything is ready. The guests have started arriving." Daniel nodded. "Thank you." James straightened Daniel's tie. "Still nervous?" Daniel smiled. "A little." James folded his arms. "Why?" Daniel looked toward the window. "I've signed million-dollar business deals without feeling nervous. But today feels different." James smiled. "Because today isn't about business. It's about love." Daniel nodded. "I've waited my whole life for someone like Grace. I'm just grateful she said yes." James smiled. "And she'll probably say yes again when the minister asks." The room filled with laughter. Daniel's nervousness slowly faded. The wedding was held in a beautiful garden surrounded by flowers and tall trees. White roses decorated the walkway leading to the stage. Blue flowers were carefully arranged beside every chair because blue was Grace's favorite color. Soft music played as guests arrived. Business leaders, friends, neighbors, and many children from the community center filled the seats. There was one special group of guests that caught everyone's attention. A bus carrying villagers from Grace's hometown slowly pulled into the parking area. The villagers stepped out, looking around in amazement. "I've never seen a place this beautiful," one elderly man whispered. Old Mama Rose smiled brightly. "Our Grace deserves every bit of this happiness." Uncle Peter walked quietly beside Aunt Martha. Neither of them spoke much. They still felt ashamed about the past. But they were grateful Grace had invited them. Sarah smiled as she looked around. "I still can't believe she's getting married." David nodded. "She looks happier than I've ever seen her." The children from the village laughed excitedly. They had never attended such a grand wedding before. Mrs. Agnes personally welcomed the villagers. "We're so happy you came." Old Mama Rose hugged her. "Thank you for taking care of our Grace." Mrs. Agnes smiled warmly. "It has been a blessing." The music changed. Everyone stood. Daniel took his place at the front beside the minister. He looked toward the entrance. His heart began beating faster. The doors slowly opened. Grace appeared. She wore the beautiful wedding dress she had chosen weeks earlier. The white gown flowed gently as she walked. Tiny pearls sparkled under the sunlight. Her veil rested softly over her shoulders. She looked graceful, calm, and radiant. For a moment, Daniel forgot to breathe. James leaned over and whispered, "I told you she'd take your breath away." Daniel smiled without taking his eyes off Grace. "She already has." Grace slowly walked down the flower-covered aisle. Soft music filled the air. The children smiled. Some guests quietly wiped away tears. Old Mama Rose cried openly. Her parents would have been so proud. Uncle Peter lowered his head. He remembered the day Grace had walked away from his house carrying only a small bag. Today she walked with confidence, surrounded by love. He silently thanked God for giving him the chance to ask for forgiveness. Grace reached the front. Daniel gently took her hands. "You look beautiful." Grace smiled. "So do you." The minister smiled warmly. "We are gathered here today to celebrate love." Everyone listened quietly. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt. The minister spoke about kindness, trust, patience, and forgiveness. He reminded everyone that a strong marriage is built on love and respect. Then it was time for the vows. Daniel looked into Grace's eyes. His voice was calm. Grace, the day I met you beside that lonely road, I thought I was simply helping someone in need. But you ended up changing my life. You reminded me that kindness is more valuable than wealth. You filled my heart with joy. I promise to love you, protect you, respect you, and stand beside you through every season of life. I will always believe in your dreams, and I will never let you face life's challenges alone. Grace smiled through happy tears. When it was her turn, she took a deep breath. Daniel, when I lost my parents, I thought I had lost everything. But God led me to you. You showed me kindness when you had no reason to. You believed in me before I believed in myself. I promise to love you with all my heart. I will support you, encourage you, and walk beside you every day. I promise to remain the same Grace you first met. The woman who believes that kindness can change the world. Many guests wiped tears from their eyes. The minister smiled. May I have the rings? Daniel gently placed the wedding ring on Grace's finger. With this ring, I choose you. Grace smiled and placed Daniel's ring on his finger. With this ring, I choose you too. The minister looked at them warmly. By the authority given to me, I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss your bride. Daniel smiled. He gently kissed Grace. The guests erupted into loud applause. Cheers filled the garden. Children clapped excitedly. Flowers were tossed into the air. Music began playing once again. Grace and Daniel walked back down the aisle hand in hand, smiling at everyone. The wedding reception was held in a large hall decorated with white and blue flowers. Crystal lights sparkled from the ceiling. Long tables were covered with delicious food. There were cakes, fruits, grilled chicken, rice dishes, salads, desserts, and many other meals. The children from the community center stared at the huge wedding cake in amazement. One little boy whispered, "That's the biggest cake I've ever seen." Everyone laughed. After lunch, it was time for speeches. James stood first. I've known Daniel for many years. I've watched him build a successful business. But today I see something even greater. I see a man who has found true happiness. Everyone applauded. Mrs. Agnes spoke next. When Grace first arrived, she carried one small bag, but she also carried a heart full of kindness. She has reminded all of us that no matter how difficult life becomes, we should never stop being good people. More applause followed. Finally, Uncle Peter slowly walked to the microphone. The room became quiet. He looked at Grace, then at Daniel. His voice trembled. I don't deserve to stand here today. Years ago, I failed Grace when she needed me most. I treated her unfairly. I sent her away. He paused, fighting back tears. But instead of returning with hatred, she returned with forgiveness. He turned toward the guests. I hope everyone here learns from my mistake. Never take the people who love you for granted. Never let pride stop you from doing what is right. Then he looked at Grace again. My daughter, I know I cannot change the past, but thank you for forgiving me. Grace walked over and hugged him. I forgive you. The guests applauded once again. It was a beautiful moment of healing. As the celebration continued, Daniel picked up the microphone one final time. I have one more surprise. Everyone became quiet. He smiled at Grace before speaking. Our wedding is about love, but we also want it to be about giving. He pointed toward a group of children from the community center. In honor of Grace's dream to help children, we are donating enough money to build a new school library and provide books, desks, and learning materials for children who cannot afford them. The room exploded with applause. Grace looked at Daniel with tears in her eyes. You did this. Daniel smiled. We did this. He gently held her hand. This is only the beginning. The children cheered loudly. Teachers hugged one another. Old Mama Rose smiled proudly. My Grace has not forgotten where she came from. As music filled the hall once again, Grace looked around at the smiling faces. She saw villagers sitting beside business leaders, children laughing with adults, old friends making new friends. people from different backgrounds celebrating together. Her heart was full. She realized that this wedding was about much more than two people getting married. It was proof that kindness, forgiveness, and love could bring people together in ways that wealth alone never could. As she danced with Daniel beneath the sparkling lights, she smiled. Their greatest adventure was no longer ahead of them. It had already begun. 6 months had passed since Grace and Daniel's beautiful wedding. Life as a married couple had been everything they had hoped for. Their home was always filled with laughter, kindness, and peace. Although Daniel was still busy managing his companies, he always made time for Grace. Every morning they shared breakfast together before beginning their day. Sometimes they talked about work. Sometimes they laughed about funny stories. Sometimes they simply enjoyed the quiet. One morning, Grace looked out of the dining room window as children played in the garden. She smiled. "They remind me of the children at the community center." Daniel looked up from his coffee. "You've been thinking about them a lot lately." Grace nodded. "I have." Daniel smiled. "What are you thinking?" Grace took a deep breath. "I want to do more." Daniel leaned forward. "What do you mean?" "I want to build a home." Daniel looked curious. "A home?" Grace nodded. "For children who have no parents." She became quiet for a moment before continuing. "I know what it feels like to lose your family. I know what it feels like to wonder if anyone loves you. I don't want other children to grow up feeling that way." Daniel smiled warmly. "I was hoping you would say that." Grace looked surprised. "You were." Daniel nodded. "I've watched your heart since the day we met. You've always cared about other people. I knew one day you'd want to help even more." Grace smiled. "So?" Daniel laughed. "So let's do it." Grace's eyes widened. "You mean?" "Yes. We'll build it together." Grace jumped up from her chair and hugged him tightly. "Thank you." Daniel laughed. "I didn't even finish my breakfast." Grace laughed too. "You can finish it later." Mrs. Agnes walked into the dining room carrying fresh bread. She smiled when she saw them hugging. "I think something wonderful has happened." Grace looked at her excitedly. "We're building an orphanage." Mrs. Agnes covered her mouth with joy. "Oh my! What wonderful news!" She hugged Grace. "So many children are going to be blessed." Grace smiled. "I hope they always feel loved." The following week, Daniel arranged a meeting with architects, builders, and charity workers. Grace sat beside him as they discussed plans. One architect spread several drawings across the large table. "This is the first design." Grace carefully studied it. "There should be more trees." The architect smiled. "More trees?" Grace nodded. "When I was little, I loved sitting under trees. They made me feel peaceful." The architect quickly made a note. Daniel smiled. "I like that idea." Another architect pointed to the playground. "We can make this area larger." Grace nodded happily. "The children need space to run and laugh." Daniel looked at her. "What else?" Grace thought carefully. "A library." Everyone looked at her. "A library?" She smiled. "When I lived with my uncle, I dreamed of reading books. I don't want these children to struggle the way I did." Daniel nodded immediately. "We'll build a beautiful library." Grace smiled brightly. "And classrooms too, so the children can learn without worrying." The room filled with excitement. Everyone admired Grace's ideas. She wasn't thinking about expensive decorations. She was thinking about what would make children feel happy and safe. Construction began only a few weeks later. Grace visited the building site almost every day. She wore simple clothes and a safety helmet as she walked around talking with the workers. The builders quickly grew fond of her. One afternoon, a worker noticed Grace carrying bottles of water. "Mrs. King," he said, surprised. "You don't have to do that." Grace smiled. "I know, but you're working very hard." She handed each worker a bottle of cold water. "Thank you." One older builder smiled. "I've worked on many projects. I've never met an owner like you." Grace laughed softly. "I'm just grateful for your hard work." Daniel arrived later that afternoon. He smiled when he saw Grace talking with the workers. One of the builders quietly walked over to Daniel. "Sir." Daniel smiled. "Yes. Your wife is one of the kindest people I've ever met." Daniel looked toward Grace with pride. "I know." Several months later, the orphanage was finally finished. It was beautiful. A large sign stood at the entrance. Grace Hope Children's Home. Grace stood quietly looking at the building. Tears filled her eyes. Daniel gently stood beside her. "What are you thinking?" Grace smiled. "I'm thinking about the little girl I used to be." Daniel looked at her. The little girl who thought nobody wanted her. She nodded. "I wish I could tell her everything would be all right." Daniel gently held her hand. "I think she'd be very proud of the woman you became." Grace smiled. "I hope so." The opening ceremony was held the following Saturday. Many guests attended. Business leaders, teachers, neighbors, journalists, children from nearby communities. Even Uncle Peter, Aunt Martha, David, Sarah, and Mama Rose came. As everyone gathered, Daniel stepped up to the microphone. "Today is a very special day. This orphanage was inspired by one person." He looked at Grace. "My wife." Everyone applauded. Daniel smiled. "Grace knows what it feels like to lose hope. That's why she wants every child here to know they are loved." More applause followed. Then Grace was invited to speak. She walked slowly to the stage. For a moment, she looked at the smiling faces before her. Then she began. "When I was 6 years old, I lost my parents." The crowd became quiet. "I thought my life was over. There were many days when I cried. There were many nights when I felt alone." She smiled gently. "But one kind person can change another person's life." She looked toward Daniel. "When Daniel stopped his car that day, he gave me more than food. He gave me hope." She turned back toward the audience. "I want every child who enters this home to receive that same hope." The crowd applauded loudly. Many people wiped tears from their eyes. Soon the first children arrived. Some had lost both parents. Others had been abandoned. Some were frightened. Some barely spoke. Grace welcomed every child personally. She knelt so she could speak at eye level. "Hello. My name is Grace. You're safe here." One little girl held an old teddy bear tightly. She looked scared. Grace smiled. "What is your name?" The little girl whispered. "Amina." Grace gently held her hand. "It's nice to meet you, Amina. Would you like me to show you your room?" Amina nodded slowly. Grace smiled. "Let's go together." She spent the afternoon helping each child settle into their new home. She helped them unpack. She introduced them to one another. She read bedtime stories that evening. The children slowly began smiling. One little boy looked at Grace before going to sleep. "Are you coming back tomorrow?" Grace smiled. "I'll be here." He smiled. "Promise." "I promise." As the months passed, the orphanage became a happy place. Every morning the children attended school. Every afternoon they played games, read books, and learned new skills. Grace visited almost every day. Sometimes she helped with homework. Sometimes she planted flowers with the children. Sometimes they baked cookies together. The children loved her. Many of them simply called her Mama Grace. The first time Grace heard those words, she became emotional. A little girl ran toward her one afternoon. "Mama Grace." Grace turned around. "Yes." The little girl hugged her tightly. "I got an A on my test." Grace smiled proudly. "That's wonderful." She hugged the little girl. "I'm so proud of you." Daniel watched from nearby. He smiled. Grace looked happier than ever. One evening, Grace and Daniel walked through the orphanage garden after the children had gone to bed. The stars shone brightly above them. Grace smiled as she listened to the peaceful sounds of the night. "Do you hear that?" Daniel listened. "What?" "The laughter." Daniel looked confused. "The children are asleep." Grace smiled. "I know, but I can still remember their laughter from earlier today." Daniel laughed softly. "You really love this place?" Grace nodded. "I do." She looked around the garden. "This place reminds me that pain doesn't have to be the end of someone's story." Daniel smiled. Neither does poverty. Neither does loneliness. Grace nodded. Exactly. Daniel gently held her hand. I've been thinking. Grace looked at him. What about? I think this shouldn't be our only orphanage. Grace's eyes grew wide. You mean? Daniel smiled. There are many children who still need help. Let's build more. Grace's eyes filled with happy tears. Really? Daniel nodded. We've been blessed. Let's keep sharing those blessings. Grace hugged him tightly. I love you. Daniel smiled. I love you too. A few weeks later, newspapers across the country published stories about Grace and Daniel's charity work. People admired not only their success but also their kindness. Many businesses donated books, clothes, and school supplies to the orphanage. Volunteers began offering their time to help the children. Teachers organized reading clubs. Doctors volunteered to provide free medical checkups. The kindness spread from one person to another. One morning, Mama Rose visited the orphanage again. She watched children running happily across the playground. She smiled proudly. Grace walked over and hugged her. What do you think? Mama Rose looked around before answering. I think your parents are smiling from heaven. Grace's eyes filled with tears. I hope so. Mama Rose gently touched Grace's shoulder. They raised a daughter with a heart full of love. And now that love is changing the lives of many children. Grace smiled through her tears. I couldn't have done it alone. Mama Rose looked toward Daniel, who was laughing with a group of children nearby. You chose a good husband. Grace smiled. The best. As the sun slowly set behind the orphanage, children laughed together on the playground. Their laughter filled the evening air. Grace stood beside Daniel, watching them with grateful hearts. The frightened orphan who had once believed she had no future had become a woman who was giving hundreds of children a reason to dream again. And although she had already found happiness, an even greater blessing was quietly waiting for her. A blessing that would make their family complete. 1 year passed after Grace and Daniel's beautiful wedding. Life had become even more wonderful than they had imagined. Their marriage was filled with love, laughter, and respect. Every morning they still ate breakfast together. Every evening they took a walk through their garden before dinner. No matter how busy Daniel became with work, he always made time for Grace. And no matter how busy Grace became with the orphanage, she always made time for Daniel. They believed that love grew stronger when people cared for each other every day. One bright Saturday morning, Grace stood in the garden watering colorful flowers. The roses were blooming beautifully. Butterflies flew from flower to flower. She smiled as she watched them. Daniel quietly walked up behind her. What has you smiling so much this morning? He asked. Grace turned around and laughed. I was just thinking. About what? About how different my life is now. Daniel gently took the watering can from her hands and set it aside. What were you remembering? Grace looked across the garden. I remembered the little girl who used to wake up before sunrise every day to fetch water. I remembered carrying heavy buckets until my arms hurt. I remembered crying myself to sleep because I thought nobody loved me. Daniel wrapped his arm gently around her shoulders. And now, Grace smiled. Now I wake up every morning feeling thankful. Daniel kissed her forehead. You deserve every bit of happiness. Grace smiled. We both do. A few weeks later, Grace began feeling tired more often. At first, she thought she had simply been working too hard at the orphanage. Mrs. Agnes noticed the change. You've been looking tired lately. Grace smiled. I've been very busy. Mrs. Agnes looked thoughtful. Maybe. But I think you should visit the doctor. Grace nodded. That's probably a good idea. That afternoon, Daniel drove Grace to the hospital. After several tests, the doctor returned with a warm smile. I have wonderful news. Grace looked curious. What is it? The doctor smiled even wider. Congratulations. You're going to have a baby. Grace stared at the doctor. For a few seconds, she couldn't speak. Daniel looked just as surprised. Did you say? The doctor laughed. Yes. You're going to be parents. Grace covered her mouth with both hands. Happy tears rolled down her cheeks. Daniel gently held her hand. He smiled so broadly that the doctor laughed again. Grace looked at Daniel. "We're going to have a baby." Daniel nodded. "We are." He hugged her tightly. Neither of them could stop smiling. On the drive home, they talked excitedly about the future. "I wonder if the baby will have your smile," Daniel said. Grace laughed. "I hope the baby has your kindness." Daniel smiled. "I hope our child has both." When they arrived home, Mrs. Agnes was waiting in the living room. She looked worried. "Is everything all right?" Grace smiled through her tears. "Everything is perfect." Mrs. Agnes looked confused. Daniel smiled. "You're going to be a grandmother." Mrs. Agnes gasped. "What?" Grace nodded happily. "We're having a baby." Mrs. Agnes hugged them both. "This house just keeps getting happier." Everyone laughed. Soon the wonderful news spread. James and Olivia visited with flowers. Michael and Rebecca brought baby gifts. Even the children at the orphanage celebrated. Little Amina hugged Grace tightly. "Mama Grace, are you really having a baby?" Grace smiled. "Yes." Amina laughed excitedly. "Can I be the baby's friend?" Grace laughed. "Of course." The children cheered loudly. Months passed peacefully. Daniel became even more protective of Grace. Whenever she tried lifting something heavy, Daniel immediately stopped her. "I'll carry that." Grace laughed. "I can still carry small things." Daniel smiled. "I know, but let me help." Mrs. Agnes laughed whenever she watched them. "I've never seen Daniel so careful." One afternoon, Grace visited the orphanage. The children gathered around her. One little boy looked at her growing belly. "Is the baby listening to us?" Grace smiled. "Maybe." The children laughed. Another little girl leaned closer. "Hello, baby." Everyone laughed even harder. Grace smiled with happiness. She realized something. Her child would grow up surrounded by love, exactly as every child should. One rainy evening, Grace and Daniel sat together on the balcony. Rain gently tapped against the roof. Daniel looked at the orphanage in the distance. "The children look happy." Grace nodded. "They really are." Daniel smiled. "Do you remember the day we first met?" Grace laughed softly. "I'll never forget. You were sitting under that big tree. You looked tired." "I was." Daniel looked at her. "What would have happened if I hadn't stopped?" Grace thought quietly. "I don't know. Maybe someone else would have helped." Daniel smiled. "I'm glad I was the one." Grace gently rested her head on his shoulder. "So am I." A few weeks later, Grace gave birth to a healthy baby girl. Daniel stayed by her side throughout the entire delivery. When the nurse gently placed the tiny baby into Grace's arms, tears filled both parents' eyes. "She's beautiful," Grace whispered. Daniel smiled. "Just like her mother." Grace laughed softly. "What should we name her?" Daniel smiled. "What about Hope?" Grace looked down at the baby. The little girl slowly opened her eyes. Grace smiled. "I love it. Hope." Daniel gently kissed Grace's forehead. "Because hope changed both our lives." Grace nodded. "It really did." The months passed quickly. Baby Hope filled the house with laughter. Mrs. Agnes loved carrying her around the garden. The children at the orphanage adored her. Whenever Grace visited, little Hope sat happily in her stroller while the older children played nearby. One afternoon, Amina gently touched Hope's tiny hand. "She's smiling." Grace smiled. "She likes you." Amina laughed happily. "I'll always protect her." Grace hugged the little girl. "I know you will." Several years passed. Grace and Daniel continued building more orphanages and schools in different towns. Thousands of children received education, food, medical care, and loving homes. Many of the first children who had lived at Grace Hope Children's Home grew into confident young adults. Some became teachers. Some became doctors. Some became engineers. Others returned to work at the orphanage, helping younger children just as Grace had once helped them. One afternoon, Grace stood in the library she had dreamed of building years earlier. Children sat around reading books together. She smiled. A little girl walked over carrying a storybook. "Mama Grace." "Yes. Will you read this to us?" Grace smiled warmly. "I'd love to." Soon dozens of children gathered around her. Just as she had done years before beneath the tree at the community center, she began reading aloud. The children laughed at the funny parts. They listened carefully to the exciting parts. Daniel quietly stood in the doorway watching. He smiled. Some things never changed. Grace still loved making children smile. Later that evening, Grace, Daniel, and little Hope visited Grace's village again. This time, they were welcomed with music, dancing, and joyful cheers. The villagers no longer remembered Grace as the poor orphan. They remembered her as the woman whose kindness had changed countless lives. Mama Rose, now older but still smiling, hugged Grace tightly. "You've made us all proud." Grace smiled. "I'll always be grateful for your kindness." Uncle Peter stepped forward. His hair had turned gray. He smiled warmly at Grace. "My daughter." Grace hugged him. He had spent the past several years making up for his mistakes. He often volunteered at the orphanage and helped care for children in the village. Grace was happy to see how much he had changed. People truly could become better if they chose to. As the sun began to set, the villagers gathered for a celebration. Children laughed as they played together. Music filled the air. Daniel looked around and smiled. "This village feels different now." Grace nodded. "It does. There is more kindness. There is more hope." Daniel squeezed her hand. "You helped make that happen." Grace smiled. "No, we all did." She looked around at the smiling faces. At Mama Rose, at Uncle Peter, at Aunt Martha, at David and Sarah, at the children running through the village. Then she looked at Daniel and little Hope. Her heart overflowed with gratitude. She finally understood something her parents had tried to teach her many years ago. Kindness is never wasted. Even when people do not appreciate it at first, kindness has a way of growing. Changes hearts. Heals families. It gives hope to those who have none. As the stars appeared in the evening sky, Grace held Daniel's hand while little Hope laughed in his arms. The frightened orphan girl who once believed her story would end in sadness had discovered that even the darkest night can lead to the brightest morning. She had found a loving husband, a wonderful family, true friends, purpose in life. And through her kindness, thousands of children found hope for a brighter future. They lived each day with grateful hearts, helping others whenever they could. And from that day forward, whenever people in the village spoke about Grace, they no longer talked about the orphan who had been thrown out of her uncle's house. Instead, they proudly told the story of the kind young woman who chose forgiveness over revenge, love over hate, and hope over despair. Her story became an inspiration to children and adults alike, reminding everyone that no matter how difficult life begins, the future can still be filled with joy if we choose kindness, courage, and love. Thanks for watching. If you enjoy the story, please subscribe to this channel and tell us where you are watching from.